We'll be talking about inclusively green, diversity, climate justice, and AI. And just as a little aside, I was fortunate enough to be a part of a international workshop of interdisciplinary researchers this past summer that Dr. Mor Barak was the organizer of, where we talked about issues of climate justice, diversity, and AI for several days in France, and it was a delightful intellectual experience. And maybe you'll have something to say about that as well too. But if not, so please give me a warm round of applause for Dr. Mor Barak, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, and wonderful to see everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to present something that is less than half-baked. So far we have research that was completed, and here are the results and so on. This is something that I've been working on for, I'd say, several years, but working on different pieces. And now I'm making an effort to bring everything together. So it's climate change in movement of people. So we call it Climagration, diversity and inclusion, and AI. And I'm going to talk about the different pieces and how we have some wonderful people that are working together on that. And we're thinking of how we could get some funding for that, get some publications. But this could be the title of the paper that I'm working on now. So I'm going to talk about three things, and very briefly, so we have enough time for you to give me some feedback and advice. So the first one is climagration on a global and national scale. The science of inclusion, what we know about that and how that is connecting to climate change, and inclusion in AI. And I'll talk a little bit about the risks and benefits for social good. I'll talk a little bit about social good in general because I wrote a paper on that and a special issue too, so I'll touch on that. So I'll start with case in point. Hurricanes in Florida. We have more of them, they're more intense. We're in the middle of it now. Helene has devastated several communities, and Milton is threatening to be even worse. And a friend of mine whose brother lives in Madeira Beach, the brother lost his home and his 2 cars and didn't have flood insurance because it was too expensive. And what this brother will have to do now, since he doesn't have the money to rebuild, and FEMA will probably help, but rebuilding in the same place that was already devastated, going to be more so in the future, might not be a good idea. So I'm bringing that because when we think of climate migration, people think, oh, people from sub-Saharan Africa who don't have water and resources are moving to Europe. But some of the climate migration will happen within countries, especially in the United States. One of the models that we saw at the conference at the Chateau de la Bretèche, where we spent lovely summer, was an AI modeling that demonstrates all the areas that could be flooded if certain events happen, and what will people do? They'll have to move. And one of the questions for us as social workers is, what happens to the people who move? Are they moving? They're moving, but what about the community? And I'll touch on that when I move forward. So let me give you an overview of climate migration. Climagration, which is climate-induced relocation. And we talk about 2 forms. One is environmental refugees. These are the people who have to flee their homes because of major disaster. Think about Katrina, think about earthquakes that devastate whole areas. So it's a major event. But what we anticipate more and more is climate and environmental migrants that will have to leave, but gradually. And I talked to a friend of mine who does modeling for insurance companies. And she says that the insurance companies are using AI in a very smart way, and they're increasing their rates in anticipation of climate change. So insurance rates could be the canary in the mine in a way for us as scientists looking to help people anticipate what will happen. The two pictures are here are some of the migrants. The issue for us studying from a scientific perspective is that the migration is not specifically climate induced if it's not a result of a climate event. In other words, this might work, see? Right? Okay. In other words, there's a difficulty in isolating environmental factors from other drivers of migration. I have a whole chapter in my book about the demographic changes and how they affect diversity in the world. So I'll give you just the taste of it. What we see in developing countries is that they have high birth rates. Their economies are too small to sustain livelihood for everyone. There's high unemployment and higher susceptibility to environmental disasters. So all of these elements create a push out of these countries. The other trend is happening in industrialized or developed countries. We have low birth rates. Most of the European developed countries are below replacement rate. Replacement rate is 2.2 children per woman. That's how demographers examine that. Most of them are at 1.2. Some countries in Asia are below 1 even. So, and that has major implications for economic activities and for the livelihood of the people. At the same time, these countries, the developed countries, have low ratios of retirees to workers, so they cannot sustain the elderly that are the cohorts that are coming in, and they have better resources to deal with climate change. So from economic perspective, there's a pool of migrants in order to sustain economic activities. That economic pool is not coordinated with the emotions of the populations that live in those countries. What I want to say is this movement of people around the world, which is unprecedented because of the ease of travel in the last several decades, is like communicating vessels. If you have a problem in one area, the migrants will flee into another area where they can provide for themselves and for their families. And the end result is increased diversity in developed countries. This is Marty Farnsworth Ritchie. She was my collaborator. She's a demographer, and she was the head of the US Census Bureau. So she is a demographer's demographer. And she and I co-wrote the chapter on demography in my book. And one of her statements is that people from diverse backgrounds with diverse human capital and diverse expectations are increasingly encountering one another in the public sphere. Okay, so let me touch on some of the consequences of this movement of people for the developed countries, and then I'll talk about developing countries. So for developed countries, we did a systematic review of the way people treat migrants and people of diverse backgrounds, primarily in times of economic difficulties. And the paper was published in the Journal of the European Journal of Management. And in that systematic review, what I found is that people are more likely to blame the other, the foreigner, the person who looks differently, who has different behaviors. They are more likely to blame them for economic difficulties. This is not far from home, as you can hear in all the rhetoric that surrounds our own election. And they are more likely to express racism, prejudice, and xenophobia, particularly during times of economic difficulties. At the same time, what we know from research is in order to move out of economic difficulties, what we do need is diversity, because the more diverse the workforce, the more creativity, the more ingenuity, the more innovations. And so there's tension between that level of resentment and the fact that specifically in difficult economic times, you do need diversity. The impact of this major movement of people on developing countries is that we see the brain drain. And this brain drain affects economies that are already pretty weak and continues to weaken them. As they become more weak, more people leave, and you can see that it's a vicious cycle that is not helping anyone. When we were in France during the conference at the Chateau, there were the European elections. And what we saw at the time was a movement to the right in the EU, in most of the countries. And it was fueled by resentment towards immigrants. It was very clear that that was what was fueling that. And you can see again the juxtaposition of the economic need that needs those people and the emotional reaction that resents the other. One of the soccer stars, football in Europe, is Mbappe. And he was talking at the time about the need for more young people to be involved in politics and to affect the acceptance of immigrants and diversity in a positive way, and how important it is for everyone. So I briefly talked about climate change and how it moves people from one place to another. I want to talk about the science of inclusion and climate justice. So I've been doing research on diversity and inclusion for the last several decades. So that's a natural area for me. So I want to touch on a few things, but I'll start with a little story of my own experience. Back in 2011, I get an email from the IMF inviting me to give them a talk. I was sure it was a mistake. Like, what do I have to do, social worker, social scientist, with the IMF? The IMF is an organization that was put together in 1948, and its goal is to prevent economic disasters on a global scale. And so their goal is to forecast any economic downturn on a global scale and alert everyone and prevent it, hopefully. What happened during the 2008 economic disaster that was global in a dimension that the world has not seen since the 1930s is that the IMF failed to predict. With all its brilliant macro economists, scientists, they failed to predict it. And so they had a commission and they produced a report. And one of the recommendations of the report was to broaden the diversity of the staff. In other words, they came to the conclusion that everyone came from those outstanding, all of the macroeconomists came from the outstanding schools of macroeconomy, but with the same way of thinking. And so you didn't have anyone to say, but wait a minute, this might be different. And as a result of that, the first woman was elected to be the Director General of the IMF. And on top of it, Christine Lagarde is also not a macroeconomist. She was a politician and a lawyer. And her tenure was one of the most successful of the IMF. The other result is, you can see this is the board of directors of the IMF. It's much more in comparison in 1948 and currently. There's much more diversity, more women at the table, more voices. This is Ted Childs, and he was the IBM chief diversity officer back in the 1980s when hardly anyone had a diversity officer, let alone inclusion, equity, and all the other words that we're using. And he was brilliant and he did amazing things at IBM. One of the concepts that was promoted not only by him, but by many others, was that diversity is good for business. You bring more people of diverse backgrounds, your business will thrive. And this was an interesting proposition, a bit simple, in my opinion, and my research supported the fact that the issue is more complicated than just let's bring diversity on board. And so I set off to examine that. And I brought my team of brilliant doctoral students. You can recognize some of them from several cohorts before. Ming-Kyang Ri, Erica Lizano, Danica Travis, and Kim Brimhall. And we did a meta-analysis of research that looks at consequences of diversity. And we looked at studies that looked at consequences on the individual level, on the group level, and organization level. And most of the research supported the idea that there is a positive connection between diversity and performance on all of those levels. But there were some studies that showed no connection and even negative connection. And all of us write and publish, and we know that there's a bias for all of us and from the journals to publish significant results that support our hypothesis, right? And so if you take into consideration that bias, you can imagine that there's more research that didn't support this idea of, yeah, let's bring diversity, we'll have positive consequences. So now it became interesting. When it's not just one cause and one effect, it becomes more interesting because it's more of a real life situation. And one of the things, I wrote a paper that discusses the false paradox of diversity. Because some of the publications that came out later on said, but wait a minute, we bring diversity on board, but then we have more miscommunication, distrust, the negative consequences. And they said, they called it the paradox, the diversity paradox. And my paper challenged that because I said, yes, it looks on the face of it as a paradox, but if you take into consideration another variable, you can see that the whole picture becomes much clearer. So the paradox basically said, the more diversity, the higher the competitive advantage for businesses because you're more innovative, you're more creative, but diversity will also bring your competitive edge down because it can bring with it intergroup tensions, conflicts, and distrust. How do we understand that? This is an interesting study by Gunther Stoll from the Vienna University. He created groups, teams. Some of them were diverse, some of them were not. And what he showed is that the diverse teams are the ones with the diagonal lines. And the diverse teams were highly ineffective or highly effective, whereas the non-diverse team was somewhere in the mediocre. So now it's really interesting to find out what makes a difference. Why are some teams that are diverse working well together and others do not? And one way to think about it is this kind of equation that actual productivity is equal to potential productivity, that for diverse teams is much higher than non-diverse teams because of creativity, understanding different clients, and so on and so forth, minus the negative relationships, the potential for negative relationships when there's misunderstanding, miscommunication, and so on. And I'll give you the insight. My research then went on to examine inclusion, and what we claim and what we found is you have to work on creating a climate of inclusion in the organization. Bringing people from diverse backgrounds can work well or not, but if you don't really work at creating a climate for inclusion, the result will not happen. Now, this is my colleague Scott Page from the University of Michigan. He's fascinating. He comes from a systems analysis perspective. I highly recommend some of his TED Talks. Very interesting because he comes at it from a different angle. And one of the examples he brings is that in the old days, when it was cutting down logs in Michigan, you can assess the team productivity by simply knowing how many logs each of the workers will cut down, and you can sum them up. And he calls it the principle of additivity. You just add that. But today, when the problems are so complicated, particularly social problems, you have a team. How would you assess their combined productivity? Are you going to measure the IQs and add them up? What will you do? And what he says is that in diverse teams, there's an added element, which he calls super additivity. And he says that basically 1 + 1 = 3, because if you take two people who come from the same background, the same education, same everything, 1 + 1 = 2. But if they come from different perspectives, different backgrounds, the interaction between them creates a third entity. Now I'm getting to the connection between diversity and climate change. Here are some national disasters that came to our attention in the last several years. The first one is Hurricane Katrina. We had the Flint, Michigan water disaster. We have in Paris, summer heat wave in 2023, when many elderly people died because there was no air conditioning and not good conditions. And the famous Aaron Brockovich case. What unites all of these is the principle that the people who are most affected by climate change and disasters are people of low income and minority and racial minorities. And so if you put it together, you can see that those who contribute the least to climate change are affected by it the most. This applies to nations and to individuals. And so I created the model of the inclusive workplace. I have several chapters in my book. I just want to say that when I talk about inclusion in organizations, typically people talk about inclusion within the organization. What I advocate is that inclusion has to include the community. It has to include disadvantaged members in the national environment. It has to include fair trade internationally and treating fairly other people and environmental justice. All of these are part of my concept of global inclusion. I'm getting to the last part of my presentation, and that is talking about inclusion, AI, and social good, and talking about the risks and benefits. From a social work perspective, this period of AI, the development of AI, is similar to the Industrial Revolution in the way it affects people's lives. And if you think back of the history of social work, Jane Addams, really, her work was propelled, the reason that she did all the work was the influx of migrants into the different communities, women who came to the workplace. And that created basically the profession of social work. What I'm saying is that AI presents all of us as social workers a new and maybe even more serious challenge. So I'll give you some examples. We already, even before AI, had what we call dark factories. Dark factories are factories that don't need humans. The machines are being designed so that they can work without people, except for the engineering that put them together and maintain them. And so they're dark factories because they operate 24 hours and they don't need light at night. The other element is they don't need humans. So what is going to happen with all the people who are going to lose their jobs with this technology that we already have and with the coming wave of AI? This is Mustafa Suleiman, one of the originators of a really significant company in AI. And he wrote a very interesting book, The Coming Wave, anticipating what will happen with AI. And in one of his presentations and in the book, he talks about the fact that in a few years, AI, if you gave AI $100,000, AI will be able to do idea generation, market study, design a product, test the product, produce the product, and sell the product with no humans. I still can't conceive of that, but if he says that, I trust him on that. So when we talk about AI for social good, I have a big question mark there because we've been operating under the perception that, yeah, AI will help us do wonderful things. And as I said, I wrote a whole paper on social good, what it is, how it works, and definition, all of that. So I really question that because I think it has the potential, but I worry about the consequences. This is Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote a couple of books that were on Obama's reading list, so I highly recommend that. He's a public intellectual, historian, very interesting person. And he says one of the dangers of the 21st century is that machine learning and artificial intelligence will make centralized system much more efficient than distributed system, and dictatorships might become more efficient than democracies. So he talks, there's a lot there about the risks of AI. This is just one quote. I can talk more about it, but I want to move on and bring it to conclusion so we can have a discussion. One more example of how AI is connected to diversity and inclusion. There's an ongoing experiment called Draw a Scientist. So it started in the 1960s, and they asked kids in 5th grade to draw a scientist. And typically, when they started in the 1960s, it was a white man in a white lab coat. Over the years, it became more diverse, more interesting. And these are two examples from recent drawings. You can see a woman scientist. She's not wearing a white lab coat, and she's out in the world, interacting with the world. The same experiment was done with AI. And this was the result. Mostly white men in white lab coats. And so AI is a technology. It learns, but it can amplify the worst instincts that we all have as humans. This is just one example. This is my colleague, Alain Klausfeld from Toulouse Business School in France. And the paper that he wrote with his colleague was to look at the guardrails, any systems that we have in place. And of course, he comes up with a conclusion that, especially from the perspective of diversity, there's a lot that needs to be done. This is actually Shini's drawing. And it's based on a study that we did together, and we just published in CDC journal, which is a big deal for social workers. And we look at, the study that we did was published and done, but we want to take the idea of community and see how community can affect the way AI is informed about us humans. So getting the community involved, because our idea is that too much is done by AI companies and by AI engineers, and social scientists are not involved. And that's my last one. We need to utilize the power of AI to address social problems, but we also need to use social science, social work, in order to create some boundaries around AI. So all of us need to be at the table, just like Eric is doing with development of AI. And that concludes my presentation, and I invite questions. That was quite a bit. How are we doing with that?
Oh, we've got 10 minutes for conversation, so we're good.
Okay.
Anyone in the room want to start?
Questions, advice, comments, input? Yeah.
Thank you, Mahal. So the thing that strikes me about AI and sort of what you were talking, kind of maybe have sort of a meta moment, is that, I just talked to a doctoral student this morning who was saying, like, I couldn't figure out this coding, so I just asked ChatGPT and I got an answer, right? And it worked. But I feel like when I was a graduate student, I would have to go ask my professor, ask my colleague, I would have to find another human being to talk to get that answer. And that inherently gives you that, like, well, maybe my stats professor isn't really, that approachable, but I have to talk to him and I just have to do this to get this, what I need, versus this, I'm just gonna pull something from AI. And so I don't really know that the question isn't here, but just reflecting on this balance between seeking solutions from AI that it's inherently not a human being for social problems, that there's just such a tangle of baby irony in there that we're not talking to each other to solve a problem that is created by each other, and we're seeking AI to help us figure this out. But in that loop, we're cutting each other out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a student ask me if they're allowed to use AI, and I said yes, because as long as they disclose and all of that. AI, first of all, is very flawed. It can give you all kinds of answers because it doesn't think for itself, so you need to think for it. But I was saying, ironically, just like you're saying, eventually AI will write their papers and our AI will grade it. But having said that, there's an interesting case in the Netherlands. They have supermarkets where you can check out and they have everything done by machines. And then they placed a human. And people were standing in line waiting to talk to the human, even though they could have done it more efficiently with the machines. So I don't know. I mean, It's a question, yeah.
Yeah, I would love to piggyback on John's comment. I love the slide where you draw a picture of a scientist. I think that provides a really good window into what the perils of AI used in simplistic ways are. Because if you ask machine learning, which is sort of the root of all of these things, essentially machine learning is statistical processes which are looking for normative responses. And so you are mining the data of what's in the past. And so you get this picture that looks very stereotypical because the universe of images that have been mined of scientists that are on the web, that are part of the database, are largely ones that look still like the images that are our 1950s
Right.
Or 1960s, I guess, version of what a scientist looks like, not what necessarily diverse children in diverse communities in America might begin to imagine their world looks like. And I think that, we need to be really thoughtful about what we're asking AI to do for us and what we're not asking AI to do for us, and then to interrogate very closely what the answers we get from these machine learning processes are, especially with respect to bias, right? And I think since your talk is so built on the idea of the promise of diversity and inclusion, I think that the real challenge of invoking AI is how do you make sure that it happens in a way that supports diversity and inclusion, and particularly inclusion, but doesn't sort of reproduce
The
segregation
biases
and
that
bias.
that we have.
I don't know that I've got a great question in there. It's just like I can't help but be like, I gotta say 2 cents about it. Sorry.
Yeah, Jeannie, and then maybe I don't know if we have
Okay.
anyone online. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting that you did you draw about these dark factories, and Jane Addams had to address that economic difficulties. And at that time, people were worried about they would lose jobs.
Right.
And indeed, 95% of the farmers are no longer farmers.
Right.
But we industrialized, we have created new jobs with the machines and powerful with our modern society. So I'm more optimistic about using AI to liberate our mind, our knowledge. I think it's more important now in terms of knowledge, because we have now our key jobs no longer like do manual work. And like with Google search engine, we didn't know search was so important, but now search power our current economy with the internet. With the AI, I think the knowledge is going to power more so for the future economy. So it's more important for our students to become more knowledgeable and they can learn knowledge quicker. So I'm more optimistic about that.
I agree with everything that you say. My concern is what happened in the Industrial Revolution is the money became concentrated
Even
in
more
the
so.
hands of fewer people.
Right.
And we might see the same thing with AI,
more so.
that the financial benefits will go to fewer and fewer people, and the rest of the world and people will not benefit from that. So we hear more and more talk about the universal basic income, that if there's wealth that is created by machines, then it should be distributed
Yes.
to more people. So what I'm saying is that social workers, we have to work at it. We can't just sit back and passively see it go by. We have to get involved and
Absolutely.
influence that
Yeah.
the change. that is
Exactly.
coming.
That's why we have that proposal.
Exactly.
And we should really pursue that.
Exactly, yeah. Any questions from anyone online? I think I see a hand.
I have a question for you. I think all of us unfortunately have, can you hear me?
We're having trouble with the audio,
Yeah.
Martin. Can you type it quickly
Yes.
in your question into the chat?
Yes, I could. Yeah. You can't hear me at all?
Vaguely, we can hear
Where
you
is it coming from? It's coming from somewhere.
somewhere. I'm hearing some little whisper.
Let me ask. Let me see if I can go ahead and, Can you hear me all?
Yeah,
at
it's
all?
probably there. I think Megan, I think you're right, going to the source.
We can hear you from home, Martin. We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I don't know. Can you hear me there at all?
That laptop has volume.
You think it's coming through the laptop?
No.
It's not.
No.
Hmm.
Bunch of social workers with no no IT.
The IT has left the room, left us to our own devices, so Martin, I'm afraid we can't hear you. Please, please.
Did
if
it
you
type?
can Type the question in or,
I'm typing it right now.
bummer.
I see that Sierra is asking, how are the community members selected to assist the development of the lens of AI and also what are the entry points for working with leaders in AI industry? Great questions, and I think Shini and I can answer it together because that was our research proposal. It hasn't been funded yet, but we have hope, right?
Yeah.
We had in our team both AI developers and representatives of community organizations. So they were at the table and part of the design of the study. Do we have other questions? How do social scientists address the generative AI bias to address the issue of inclusion and diversity? Should social scientists create an AI for social workers? Wow, that's complicated. Eric, do you want to take that?
I mean, twice. Sure, I'll take that. I think that generative AI's bias toward of inclusion and diversity is something that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure that social workers have the resources to create an alternative, but I think we do have a voice to elevate these as concerns and to push AI developers to create models that are less stereotype driven. And I think that there is an interest from the from tech developers around this. I just think that they often don't understand the issues to look at until it's, it's staring at them afterwards.
What we have, I'll address it in several ways. One is what we have are several AI developers who saw the light after the monster was released. And like Mustafa, can't remember his last name, and he wrote a whole paper about the risks of AI. So that's one. And the second, the article that I mentioned by Alain Klausfeld proposes several guidelines for governments to intervene. In other words, it's not necessarily on us as social workers to do it, but it's on us to make it happen, to help others do it and promote it. I think we're at the end of our time.
Yeah, I think we are. So I'd like to, if we can all just thank Michal one more time.